Franklin Roosevelt ran on a campaign of cleaning up the government, having an honest government. But what he's really out there doing, he's just convincing people that he cares about them.
Hello there. Franklin D. Roosevelt, running for state senate.
Eleanor said when he first started speaking, he spoke so slowly that there were big pauses between everything he said, and she was afraid he would never go on with his speech.
Hello, how are you?
My niece.
Your niece, hello.
But then after a while, when he got comfortable and he kept talking and talking, she was afraid he'd never stop speaking.
Hello, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
He not only found his voice in that campaign, but he found his vocation. He knew there was something inside of him that wanted to make other people's lives better.
Roosevelt managed to win as a Democrat, although this was a very conservative Republican area. Roosevelt was not expecting to serve in the New York State Senate for the next 40 years. What he was doing was following in the footsteps of Uncle Teddy.
Roosevelt realized that to be successful in American politics, you have to show that you can do something for the national party. So in 1912, when Woodrow Wilson is running for president, in those pre-radio, pre-television days, when candidates required proxies, Franklin Roosevelt is promoting Woodrow Wilson.
And he's campaigning against his cousin, Teddy, the man that he idolizes. He realized this was a great opportunity for the Democrats to win the election, but more importantly, that this would give him an inside track into getting into Washington and getting out of the state legislature.
In 1912, there were 3 candidates: William Howard Taft, who was the incumbent president, former President Theodore Roosevelt, and Governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. The Democrats win the election. Woodrow Wilson becomes president. And now Franklin D. Roosevelt, having supported Wilson, gets a slot in the Wilson administration.
FDR supports Woodrow Wilson without infuriating Uncle Teddy, and pleases Wilson to such an extent that Wilson is willing to give him his wish to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's political talent at a very young age.
As the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position his cousin Teddy Roosevelt had, Franklin is elevated to the national stage at a crucial point in history.
In August 1914, World War I breaks out in Europe. It's hard to imagine in 1914 that the U.S. would ever get involved.
As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin is perpetually impatient. He's convinced during the early years of World War I that America in general and the Navy Department in particular are just not doing enough to get ready for war. Franklin is constantly pushing to expand the Navy, sometimes going around his superiors' instructions to do so.
In 1915, the Germans sink the Lusitania, one of the most famous and luxurious passenger liners of the time, and there's nearly 2,000 people on board, and nearly 1,200 of those perish, including 123 Americans. This almost causes war, but there's, a real pushback inside the United States about going to war. Then in 1917, the Germans send a telegram to the government of Mexico saying, if you declare war on the United States, we will give you support to take back the land you lost in the Mexican-American War.
Woodrow Wilson finally was out of options for neutrality. And the United States joined World War I in April of 1917.
But there's a lot of pressure on FDR to go to war the same way Teddy Roosevelt had done during the Spanish-American War.
Franklin wanted desperately to be a soldier himself and went to Wilson and asked the president, can I go? And he said, no, you're more important than staying here. So even so, he wanted at least to be able to go over and visit the troops.
So in 1918, FDR arrives in France and tours a number of these battlefields and was immersed in the horrors of the war.
Saw with his own eyes and heard with his own ears the savage onslaughts of the Germans against the Allies.
There are a lot of weapons systems that are introduced in World War I for the first time. Airplanes, tanks, machine guns, and the other are artillery pieces, which are so powerful and so destructive that they can literally vaporize people. It's an unprecedented level of killing and an unprecedentedly gruesome level of killing.
He describes being on the battlefield and hearing the whistle of German shells flying overhead and exploding nearby.
We passed on to the south slopes of Fort Douaumont, a quarter of a mile beyond. And sure enough, the long, whining whistle of a shell was followed by the dull boom of the explosion.
This was a deeply moving experience for him. Franklin Roosevelt truly believed that America had a moral responsibility as well as a political responsibility to be a player on the world stage.
In 1918, the Allies win World War I. A lot of the unsolved problems of America remain below the surface.
Men have to return to jobs. Some of these jobs are still available, some of them aren't. And labor wars are erupting all over manufacturing centers in the United States. And for returning African Americans, what they discovered was that the reign of Jim Crow was even more entrenched.
In 1919, Woodrow Wilson suffers a terrible stroke. He's essentially incapacitated for the rest of his term. Franklin's hero, Teddy Roosevelt, has recently died, and Franklin is looking at what is his next step.
In 1920, women had just gotten the vote. FDR was good looking. The Democrats wanted a good looking guy to run for vice president. And so FDR got on the ticket with Governor Cox of Ohio, the Democratic candidate, who probably knew he was going to lose.
For a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy to leap from that job to the national ticket as candidate for vice president, this was the gift of all times, because Roosevelt knew that even if Cox lost, FDR would be a well-known presidential figure of the future.
James Cox loses. It was a disaster for the Democrats, but Roosevelt comes out. He's now this national figure, and everybody knows him. And he is seen as one of the most appealing Democrats in the country.
The cars proceeded down toward the Capitol in the distance, bearing with them the hopes of the country for a new deal.
The Depression was a tumultuous, complicated period of time. But Franklin Roosevelt's fundamental conviction was that you had to show that the system could respond, and that therefore the system was worth defending.
The fate of democracy hangs in the balance. This is not an understatement. This is a moment in which leadership is vitally important.
This is a day of national consecration. First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This nation asks for action, and action now. The people of the United States have not failed in their need. They want direct, vigorous action.
His first inaugural, he talks about how we cannot let the Depression paralyze our efforts or convert advance into retreat. I've always thought it was fascinating that he used the word paralyze. And I don't know how conscious it was, but it was a sign that he saw the world as motion. And he no longer could move literally, so he would use all of his energies to help the country move figuratively.
He sets up an expectation from the American public that you have to help me. If we want to get through this problem, I can do some things, but you have to do other things.
And the most important thing he did was to say the people are not responsible for this depression. The failure of leadership is responsible. And I am here to give that leadership. And with that leadership, there would be hope, there would be jobs. Here is this paralyzed man who is making the people who feel paralyzed feel hope once again. And he said, we need action, and we need action right now. And if the Congress will not give me what I need, I will use the broad powers of the executive as if we were at a war.
We all know what we're up against, but now it's our turn to fix it.
The economy has been plunging for 3 years, and it still hadn't found bottom. And the critical thing at that particular moment was that the banking system had seized up. One of the reasons the banks failed is the banks had taken that money and invested it in the stock market. And so when the stock market went down, they didn't have enough money to pay their depositors. So banks were simply closing. They had already closed by the thousands. And it looked as though America's national financial system was on the verge of utter collapse.
It's important to realize there was no safety net in those days. If a bank collapsed, the federal government wasn't going to help you.
It is a real crisis, a crisis that no one could ever have imagined hitting one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Was capitalism failing? Had capitalism actually failed?
Many people thought the United States of America as a political entity was over, that our capitalist system was over.
The country's on the edge of a cliff, but we're not going to let it fall. The first thing we're going to do is to declare a banking holiday. It'll prevent further runs and buy time for Secretary Wooden to draft some legislation.
You're going to have to expand presidential authority if you want to get anything done.
Precisely. But first, we have to figure out which banks can be saved and which have to close.
March 5th, essentially his first act as President of the United States is to close every bank in America.
The banks were going to close for a week. They're going to open Monday morning.
Now he uses a wonderful phrase. He calls it a bank holiday.
And that gave Franklin a chance to call Congress into an emergency session. And incredibly, in the space of several hours, they passed this huge emergency banking bill.
Divide up the banks into 3 categories. Those banks that are healthy enough to reopen, those banks that can reopen but are going to need help from the federal government, and those banks that are so bad that there's not much we can do about them.
New money backed by real assets pours from Uncle Sam's treasury to revitalize the country's commerce.
This emergency banking bill will allow them to have currency shipped to the banks that are stable enough to handle it. Planes are on the tarmac ready to fly the currency to each one of the banks.
Before Roosevelt, before this moment in American history, the federal government had never taken it upon itself to bolster an industry the way the federal government was bolstering the banking industry. It was quite a striking, even a revolutionary thing for the government to undertake.
Franklin's afraid that once they've opened the banks again, that people will then rush to take their money out because they haven't had it for a whole week, and then the whole system would collapse.
This was 0 hour. So FDR has got the biggest challenge for a leader, which is make people feel a little bit reassured, and at the same time, get them to do something that their instincts tell them not to, which is keep your money in the banks.
Franklin decides on a Sunday night before the Monday opening, he's going to give a fireside chat to the people. This is really the first presidential fireside chat.
Nervous? What's there to be nervous about? I just have to convince the entire American public to trust me with their life savings.
In 13 minutes.
Got it. NBC says ready to go. CBS is live.
10 seconds, Mr. President. And 5, 4.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it has been done and what the next steps are going to be. This bank holiday, while resulting in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. It is possible that when the banks resume, people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear that the banks will take care of all needs. I can assure you that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress.
80% of the adult radio audiences are listening. And it was said that streets were empty at the time because everybody's sitting staring at their radio.
We have provided the machinery to restore our financial situation. It is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
Remarkable piece of work. In the space of just less than 15 minutes, he calls on the American people. And he says, basically, we have done what we can do here in Washington. Now we look to you. And with your support, our work will succeed. And so he puts the American people essentially into potential cooperation with the administration.
Franklin gives this address on Sunday night, and the big question is what's going to happen tomorrow morning when we reopen the banks.
The next day would be the true test. Did this work? If it fails, then it will mean the whole financial system will fail in the very first week of his presidency.
It is not an exaggeration to say that the country is on the verge of collapse.
Miss Lahan, today's lunch menu.
Jelly to bouillon.
Mrs. Nesbitt says it's nutritious.
I like it.
Have you heard anything?
Not yet.
Maybe we should cancel the president's lunch.
Because of the bouillon?
Well, now there's two reasons. No, I'm concerned if things don't go our way with the banks.
They will. They have to.
It's Monday morning. And there's long lines at the bank again, and they panic. Maybe they've come to take their money out. Did this work?
We should have heard something by now.
You think it's a bad sign?
No news is no news. Yes. I see. Thank you. They're standing in line. They're bringing their money back. We're going to be okay.
They're actually carrying satchels of money to bring their money back to the banks. So that night, headlines, confidence in banking system resumed, banking crisis over.
And the only thing that has changed is FDR's leadership and his ability to convince the American public that he has solutions, that things will get better, and it is an extraordinary moment in American history. FDR essentially ends the banking crisis in one simple radio broadcast.
Franklin Roosevelt made government an ambient force in the lives of people who might otherwise have only encountered the government at the post office or perhaps the subsidized railroad or something.
People felt that FDR had saved their lives, saved their children's life, given them a chance to go forward.
After Roosevelt is successfully reelected for a third term, he decides he's going to take a vacation aboard a naval ship. And so he goes out in the Caribbean and he sits on the deck and he goes fishing and he looks out at the water and he just thinks.
By then, England desperately needed our weapons to fight back against Germany.
And it looks as though Hitler might very well win. And if the Germans take control of Britain, then Germany will reign supreme basically from Poland to the Atlantic Ocean.
Churchill. He can't hold out much longer. They're broke.
Winston always exaggerates.
Yes. But this feels different. That damn neutrality law has us in a box. Damn it. Lend me yours, all right? A moment ago, I was out of fluid. So you let me use your lighter. I needed it. You let me use it.
So we give Churchill tanks and planes instead of selling them. Last time I checked, that would be illegal too.
No. We don't give them tanks and planes. We lend them.
FDR was canny and cunning, and he knew how to get things done through sleight of hand. And this worked for him perfectly on what we came to call Lend-Lease.
Because the Allies can't pay for anything, we can lend them military hardware, we can lend them supplies, and at some unspecified point in the future, they can pay for them.
And he has a wonderful metaphor for it. He says if your neighbor's house catches on fire, you're going to loan him your garden hose to put it out. And you're not going to charge for it.
When they started the Lend-Lease debate in the Congress, it wasn't clear it could get through. But Roosevelt was always moving step by step to get the American public educated as to where they had to go.
First, in late December, he gives a fireside chat.
We must have more ships, more guns, more planes, more of everything. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
He said if we produced these ships and tanks and weapons and planes and got them to England, and England was able to fight back against Germany, maybe that would prevent us from getting into the war.
And then on January 6, 1941, FDR is delivering a State of the Union. And he centers his speech around values, these 4 principles, these 4 freedoms. And he says everyone is entitled to freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear.
Where do you stand? Who are we going to be? And when you put it that way, then of course you're going to bring the country with you.
And it worked. Congress said yes.
And so this allows for billions of dollars of greatly needed supplies, not only to go to Great Britain, but go to many other Allied powers to be able to withstand the onslaught from the Axis powers.
Because of FDR's leadership, Lend-Lease was able to really have an enormous impact in that war.
June of 1941, Hitler orders German troops to attack the Soviet Union.
More than 2 million men plunged into a front 2,000 miles long.
Before all this began, the United States was suspicious of the communists of the Soviet Union, but now the Soviet Union is fighting against Germany. Now, that changes things.
Churchill famously says, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd support the devil. But how can we give arms or aid to Soviet Russia, where Joseph Stalin purges, kills, exiles hundreds of thousands, so he reigns supreme?
FDR doesn't know much about Stalin. Stalin's crimes are not well publicized. And so FDR sends Harry Hopkins, his great friend and envoy and all-purpose aide, to meet Stalin and take the measure of him. And Hopkins comes back and reports to FDR that Stalin is somebody you can do business with. He's not presenting him as the great terrorist, the great killer.
And so FDR is going to argue immediately to extend Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union.
As German armies advanced east, they committed unspeakable genocidal war crimes against Jews as they found them in Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, parts of the Soviet Union. And most of these killings were done by special units of SS Gestapo personnel who were killing Jews with bullets, killing them in any way that they could. At a meeting outside of Berlin, which takes all of about 90 minutes, including breakfast, the Germans decide that the final solution to the Jewish question will be the mass murders of Jews.
In the summer of 1941, FDR and Churchill decide it's time for them to meet face to face. So he announces at a press conference that he's going to be cruising up the Atlantic seaboard in the presidential yacht. Sure enough, he waves to the people on the shoreline, and that night he's transferred to the USS Augusta and heads up for a secret rendezvous with Winston Churchill in Placentia Bay in Newfoundland. Churchill, meanwhile, crosses the German submarine-infested North Atlantic to meet with Roosevelt. The Augusta is at anchor, and literally out of the fog emerges this great British battleship, the HMS Prince of Wales.
It was an incredible moment that these two leaders were in this place at that time.
Glad to have you aboard, Mr. Churchill.
At long last, Mr. President.
The fate of the world did depend on this relationship between the two men.
We're ready to carry on alone, if we must.
I'm committed to sending everything you need. In my view, you're fighting for all of us now.
Of course, I'd rather have a declaration of war from America now, and no supplies for 6 months, than double the supplies and no declaration.
You know, Winston, that Congress declares war, not me. And I'm on thin ice with them. There's nothing I'd like better than to kick Hitler in the teeth. You know that. But timing is everything.
Yes. Timing.
Churchill was the suitor. FDR was the pursued. Winston Churchill once said, "No lover ever studied the whims of his mistress as I did those of Franklin Roosevelt." Churchill was not an elusive figure. You knew what he was thinking, sometimes to a fault. FDR was ironic, flexible, slippery in a way, but they needed each other.
What about Japan? Suppose they attack one of our colonies in Asia. Or one of yours.
America doesn't have colonies.
The Philippines, Guam. Call them what you like. Territory under your control.
And FDR was incredibly frustrating to Churchill. Churchill is fighting for his life, for the life of constitutional democracy. And FDR is incredibly elusive.
If Japan does something like that, I'll have to respond, of course. But it's my opinion that would be the wrong war at the wrong time in the wrong place.
I agree. Europe comes first.
Churchill's dreams since he was a little boy and his ideas of heroism are often about saving something from collapse, about saving the world as he knows it from disaster. Meanwhile, Roosevelt is not an imperialist. He is someone who is extremely idealistic politically. And rather than wanting to save something historic in the past, he really is looking to the future and he wants to build something new.
Then the next morning, Roosevelt gets himself over to the Prince of Wales ship. The sailors are all there, the British and American sailors. It's an incredible moment. And they sing hymns together. And somehow that got to Roosevelt. The same language, the same values, the same hymns.
Afterward, he turns to his son and said, "If nothing else had happened while we were here, that would have cemented us."
The two of them become more than partners, more than allies. They become friends in a very deep way. They share this passion for naval history. They share this ability to understand the global picture.
FDR said to Churchill, "It's fun to be in the same decade with you." Churchill said about FDR, meeting him was like opening your first bottle of champagne, in Churchill's case, of the day.
They disagree fundamentally on colonialism and the fate of the British Empire, but they draft the Atlantic Charter, which is this extraordinary statement that says, here are the values that we believe are worth fighting for.
I think it was the most important diplomatic friendship in the history of the world. Roosevelt and Churchill were unique. Their challenges were unique, and they rose to the occasion together.
All clear. Keep watching, or I'll get coffee.
It's a beautiful day. It's an early morning. It's a Sunday. Most people, either military or civilian, are still in bed. And it seems like another placid day in Hawaii in the Pacific.
The United States does have many indications that something is going to happen. They've broken the Japanese codes.
They know that the Japanese ambassadors are going to come to Washington at a very specific time on December 7th to present their rejection of FDR's final proposal.
And therefore, we should be on alert because something's going to happen. But the Japanese start planning the attack on Pearl Harbor long before the breakdown in relations. They're going to keep radio silent, 6 aircraft carriers, 33 ships, 414 aircraft. They're going to cover 3,500 miles worth of northern Pacific Ocean and arrive about 200 miles off the northern part of Hawaii on the morning of December 7th. 6 o'clock in the morning, they're going to launch 189 planes in a first wave.
Pearl Harbor, at this point, houses the great majority of the Pacific Fleet. Its majority of its destroyers, its battleships.
Jeez. Did you guys hear that?
FDR is sitting in his study with his stamps. He's there with his close advisor, Harry Hopkins, who lives in the White House.
Yes. Knox, what is it? No. They've attacked Pearl Harbor.
That can't be right. Must be a mistake. The Japanese do not have the guts.
But they have. While their so-called diplomats are sitting with our Secretary of State. Get everybody in here.
The Japanese see that the harbor is filled with sitting ducks, these great vessels filled with crew members, filled with ammunition, and they're all tied up and they're all right next to each other. So it's like shooting fish in a barrel.
They're attacking with a second wave right now. How many?
It's Battleship Row. They hit them all. 8 sunk or incapacitated. The Arizona lost with all hands.
Why, in God's name, were they all tied up at dock?
Given how surprised they were and how ill-prepared they were, the Americans really put up a pretty brave fight. The one great failure of Japanese intelligence is that they don't know the aircraft carriers aren't there. So the 3 American carriers end up escaping this attack. but it's too little too late.
18 ships are sunk or heavily damaged. 2,402 military personnel are killed. Another 1,247 are wounded. Nearly 60 civilians are killed.
They take out hundreds of American aircraft, and they destroyed critical airfields and wharves.
The shock was then amplified by the series of attacks. Pearl Harbor was just one of more than 10 invasions and attacks that happened all across the Pacific, including Singapore and Malay and eventually the Philippines. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. This is the worst day in FDR's life. He was so committed to the U.S. Navy. When he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was actually at the keel-laying ceremony for the USS Arizona, and now it lay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor.
After Pearl Harbor, everyone who was in the White House on that day said FDR exhibited a deadly calm. While aides are running in and out with one report worse than the next report, in a panic, he just remained calm. Eleanor said that at times of great crisis, he could actually be an iceberg. But that anger and those feelings were inside.
Maybe 2,000 of our boys dead. More than 100 planes lost. God knows how many ships.
You cannot blame yourself.
It was on my watch.
Hello?
Prime Minister Churchill.
Winston,
Mr. President, what's this about Japan?
they've attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We're all in the same boat now.
Well, this simplifies things.
It certainly does.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Late in the afternoon, he lights a cigarette, calls Grace Tully, his secretary, and dictates the great speech with punctuation. Yesterday, comma, December 7th, 1941, comma, a date which will live in world history, was the first line.
And he makes one of the most extraordinary edits, and he crosses out world history.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
When he goes to the joint session of Congress, that anger and fury are underneath the resolve and determination, and it was just exactly what people needed to hear. This is treachery. This will not stand.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Most people are completely shocked by crisis, either economic crisis or war. FDR was not shocked. He'd been through the crisis of his own loss of his limbs. Most people think they don't have the confidence to deal with these terrible things. FDR had a lot of confidence.
The average American went to bed on December 6th lukewarm about the prospect of going to war. By the afternoon of December 7th, many of them believe what Admiral Nimitz says as he steams back into Pearl Harbor. When we're done with those people, the only place that they will speak the Japanese language is in hell. And effectively, what they do is they wake a sleeping giant. December 8th, we declare war on Japan. Ironically, on the 11th of December, Germany declares war on the United States.
And then finally, we can declare war on them. That was the war he knew he needed to happen.
Roosevelt can take off the gloves, and he can lead Americans openly and honestly into war against fascism, which was the greatest threat democracy had ever faced.
To say that there's a lot riding on D-Day, Operation Overlord, is a massive understatement. Operation Overlord is the culmination of years of effort by Franklin Roosevelt to convince Americans that they needed to be prepared for the war. And then once we entered the war, taking an army of just a couple 100,000 and building it up, putting people into uniform by the millions. Just the logistics of that alone is pretty staggering. And training all those folks and outfitting all those folks. It is the largest military operation ever undertaken in history. It involves so many people, so many layers of military apparatus, from transports and tanks, ammunition, soldiers and sailors, communication devices, aircraft, tremendous amount of coordination.
It's an extraordinarily difficult operation.
The Atlantic Wall is a system of defense that the Germans start to create from the moment they take Europe. This is what the Allies have to break in order to get into Europe. It's basically a 1,700-mile wall that starts in Norway, goes all the way to the Spanish coast. If you think about the Atlantic Wall as these 15,000 bunkers as being the skeleton, the trenches that connect them would be the sinew that connects those bones. The cannons would be the muscles that make it all work. In front of that would be 6,000 mines, the obstacles on the beaches, the obstacles in the field to keep gliders from landing. That would be the armor or the skin. And then ultimately, the soldiers that defend it would be the blood that pumped through it.
In the build-up to what becomes Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, the Allies create all kinds of diversions, all kinds of fake radio traffic, even using fake tanks and things like that to create the illusion that this may be a three-pronged or a two-pronged operation, all to get the Germans to not mass their forces, and what ultimately becomes the main point of contact at Normandy.
We need waves that are less than 5 feet. We're going to land at dawn. We'd like to have a half a moon. We'd like to have 2,500 feet of cloud ceiling. We'd like to have at least 50% visibility. How do we get those conditions to happen?
On the eve of D-Day, this is the culmination of years of preparation, years of building the supplies, years of coalition building. Now there's nothing more that FDR can do. He had to believe that he had supplied the soldiers the best they could, that they were trained and they were ready for this, and there was nothing he could do but depend upon those soldiers.
Across June 6th, we're going to put 155,000 soldiers on the beach on one day. You got 7,000 ships, 13,000 aircraft, all in support of this. It's the greatest joint Army, Air Force, Navy, coalition, multi-service, military operation in the history of Earth. If you were in the first wave at D-Day, you would have left your port early in the morning of June 6th. You would have made your way across rough seas. You were probably seasick. They tried to give you some breakfast. You took it, and now you've thrown that up. All the toilets are full. All the rails are full. You've now gotten on a landing craft, climbed down a slippery rope to get in that landing craft. You would have been splashed by sea waves, soaking wet, carrying 60 pounds of gear. You can hear the aircraft go overhead. You hope they're doing their part. And in front of you, you would see German defenses, mines and barbed wire, artillery and mortars and machine guns. Then all of a sudden, the boat would hit the beach, and then they would drop the ramp.
FDR had made the decisions he could make and was now at the mercy of events, of time and tide, quite literally.
Come in.
From General Eisenhower, Mr. President.
"10 seconds, Mr. President." and 5, 4.
My fellow Americans, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard, for the enemy is strong. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. By the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. We shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations, into a world unity that will spell a sure peace, and a peace that will let all of men live in freedom. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen.
That speech was arguably the largest mass prayer in human history. 100 million Americans listened.
Church bells rang, and everybody went to churches and synagogues. The impulse to pray was overwhelming.
By noon on June 6, 1944, even defenses around Omaha Beach, bloody Omaha Beach, will start to break. And now what we have is the invasion is a success. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's prayer speaks volumes. He's responsible for speaking for all freedom-loving people. What Operation Overlord stands for, it's hope. Liberty's not just this ethereal idea. Liberty is coming.
It's January 1945, and it looks like finally, after a half-decade of war, the war in Europe will finally come to a close sometime in the late spring or early summer. And with this brings pressing questions that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin have to address, and they're questions that they feel they can only address in person. So they decide that they're going to have a conference together at the Levadia Palace on the Black Sea, the farthest west that Stalin will go.
Yalta on the Black Sea was the scene of a Big Three meeting. Here starts a series of talks that will profoundly influence the diplomatic and political future of the world.
February 1945, they're starting to plan the post-war world. And you have three people that see the world very differently.
The Big Three arrive at Yalta with distinct goals. Roosevelt wants to bring the Soviet Union into the war against the Japanese. But Roosevelt also has a personal goal that's looking even farther into the future. After the war's over, he wants to create a new organization for international peace, the United Nations.
FDR believes the United Nations will help the world resolve its problems, will help de-escalate militarism, and make the world a safer place into the future.
For Churchill and Stalin, their objectives from Yalta are really centered around Poland. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty in 1939, and the Polish government has been in exile in London ever since. Churchill wants to make sure that when all of this is over, that Poland is free, that they are independent and have self-determination. Stalin wants to make sure that they are going to have a government in Poland that's controlled by Stalin.
FDR never thought that Soviets and Americans ultimately had the same political ideals. But as a tough political leader, Roosevelt knew at the beginning of 1945, the only way to finish off this war is to keep the Soviets fighting, and that may mean allowing Stalin to do a lot of things that Roosevelt would have preferred that he not do.
Каждый раз, когда немцы вторглись в мою страну, они сделали это через Польшу. Так что Польша должна иметь правительство, которое дружественное с Советским Союзом. Я уверен, что вы понимаете, что для нас это обсуждение не подлежит.
Of course, we want Poland's government to be friendly. But most importantly, it must be decided by the Polish people.
Which means, Marshal Stalin, the members of the Polish administration who've been taking refuge in my country should be included in the government. But you have shut them out and put your own people in.
А что думает о этом президент Рузвельт?
I'm assuming that you will honor our previous agreement that Poland will enjoy free elections under American and British supervision.
В Польше более миллиона советских войсков. Сколько американцев? Мы те, кто пожертвовали так много, чтобы освободить Европу от нацистов. Итак, мы будем теми, кто обеспечит их демократию.
Then swear to me that you will guarantee free elections in Poland.
Я обещаю. Надеюсь, моего слова будет достаточно.
I will need your word on something else, too. I want you to join the war against Japan.
The legacy of Yalta was complicated when they depart. They have reached agreements that are going to lead to peace, to a better world. And yet Churchill is deeply concerned that Stalin has no intention of honoring his agreements, especially when it comes to guaranteeing free elections in Poland. Roosevelt does succeed in drawing the Soviet Union into his plan for the United Nations. He also walks away with a commitment from Stalin to join the fight in the Pacific.
We now look back on the Yalta Conference, 1945, and many people would say, why did Roosevelt give up Eastern Europe? Was it because he was old and sick? No, it was because the Soviet army owned an awful lot of Europe, and no matter how charming or how angry Roosevelt got at this conference, his personal skill was not enough to overcome that.
Roosevelt believed that he was going to keep going back to Stalin to negotiate issue by issue as things unfolded. He didn't see Yalta as this climactic act. It was not supposed to be the final word.
Mrs. Roosevelt,
Yes.
I'm sorry, but you're needed at the White House right away.
Right away.
Eleanor gave her talk, and she said she knew that something dreadful had happened.
As his cousin Daisy Sulkley said, Franklin Roosevelt, the hope of the world, has died.
Eleanor summoned Vice President Truman to the White House.
And she puts her hand on his shoulder, and she says, "Harry, the president is dead." And Truman says, "Oh, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry. You know, what can I do for you?" And she says, "That's the wrong question, because you're the one that's in trouble now."
From his beloved second home at Warm Springs, Georgia, the body of Franklin Delano Roosevelt moves on the first stages of its journey to his final resting place.
There's immense public grieving. There's this sense that the glue that had held the country together had cracked. That someone who had seemed perennial was actually temporal. And the New York Times that day wrote, "Men will thank God on their knees 1,000 years from now that Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House when he was." There was a daily government list of casualties that went out. And the top casualty that day was Roosevelt Franklin Delano, Commander-in-Chief.
There was a sense of his being the only president for lots of people that they'd ever known. 12 years is a long time. Having carried them through the Depression, carried them through the war, feeling a sense of connection to him. The kids who went to the civilian conservation camps become the soldiers in World War II. There's this story of somebody who's crying during the funeral, and they say to him, an old man, he's crying, "Did you know President Roosevelt?" He said, "No, but he knew me."
Franklin Roosevelt rescued democracy and capitalism in their hours of maximum danger. And the fact that we have a market economy and a republic, if we can keep it, is in no small measure because of his fundamental belief in the constitutional order.
Ambition is the most mysterious part of leadership. FDR had this ambition that's large, but it's for something larger than himself.
FDR had this great gift for understanding what the American people needed.
FDR made us better than we are. He could call on our better angels.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
There was something about that voice, there was something about that smile that suggested it's gonna be okay.
Roosevelt opened the eyes of Americans to positive effects that government could have on individual lives.
Everybody talks at the end about how he'll be remembered for having gotten us through the Depression, carrying us through World War II, and there's Social Security and all these things you can see in the history books. He would say, it's the bond with the people that I've established and that I care for. Underneath all those laws are people, and there are people whose lives he's affected and people who he helped to get them back on their feet in the 30s, to be ready to be the greatest generation in the 40s. And I think that's what he'd want to be remembered for.
Americans have always been lucky. We got Lincoln when we needed him, we had Washington when we needed him, and we had FDR when we needed him.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.